Okay, let's start. This is Tony Papert, your host. This is LaRouche PAC's Saturday evening class for the July 22nd, 2023. Tonight's class is by Susan Kakinda. She's called it Plato Looks at the 2024 Presidential Candidates. I mean, as Susan will go into much more depth, Plato and Socrates lived during the self-destruction of Greek society of the Peloponnesian War, during which Greece ceased to be the leading power in the world in culture, science, civilization, and gradually became a backwater, which never played a critical role in history, again to the present day. Plato and Socrates were acquainted with all the leading figures in not only in Athens where they lived, but as well many in other parts of Greece. And they fought a great battle with others to avert Greece's effective suicide in the Peloponnesian Wars. So it's with a view looking backward from today's circumstances as the 2024 presidential election approaches, back to these struggles in ancient Greece, that our class tonight will take us. So with that, Susan, please begin.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Tony. Let me start with an event that took place this week that I'm sure most people are acquainted with. And that is what happened to RFK Jr. when he appeared in the Congress to talk about censorship and ran into the full fury of a bunch of Democratic furies. One would wish that a master with the power of Plato were here today to actually render dramatically the implications of that. But of course, this insane attack on RFK, calling him an anti-Semite because he cited a scientific study which identified the fact that certain genetic strains, such as Chinese and Ashkenazi Jews, did not seem to be as susceptible to COVID. He simply cited a scientific study. This, of course, became the screaming headlines throughout the press that he was anti-Semitic. He was saying that this was a deliberate bioweapon, and on and on and on and on. Now, this has been happening to Donald Trump all along, but there's a certain starkness when the Democrats do it to the son of the assassinated Bobby Kennedy and the nephew of the assassinated John Kennedy. So when I'm speaking about the 2024 presidential candidates in this discussion, I'm largely not talking about Donald Trump and RFK Jr., because while they're different, there's a certain commonality, and that is a certain fearlessness of speaking the truth, no matter what the consequences may be, no matter what the powers that be determine that you're supposed to say or not be able to say. When you look at the other gaggle of presidential candidates, I think you could appropriately call it a grouping of not very well-trained sophists. And I think as we go through this discussion, it'll become a little bit clearer what I mean. But by way of just initial statement, sophistry, which was one of the philosophical diseases that destroyed Athens, is based on the idea that there is no truth, and that it's simply your ability to craft a rhetorical argument or have the weight of the state behind you, as you saw in the hearing with RFK Jr. the other day, to simply state that falseness is truth, black is white, and so on. I call them badly trained sophists because for those who watched Tucker Carlson pretty much destroy the campaign of Mike Pence, and similarly some of the other candidates, they're clearly badly trained. That is, they simply are shoveled their talking points, their speaking points, and so on, and are completely incapable of responding to somebody like Tucker Carlson, who simply asked the questions that a normal human being would ask. And they simply dissolved in the face of that. What I want to do tonight, and Tony is going to be assisting me in this in the latter part of the presentation, is look at the tragedy of Athens. First, I'm going to look at it through the eyes of Plato himself, whose early life spanned the disaster which befell Athens in the Peloponnesian War. And then we're going to back up a little bit and look at the earlier generation through and the tragedy of Athens again through the person of Alcibiades, who was about a generation older than Plato. And the dialogue that we're going to look at tonight is the Alcibiades dialogue, which is written to have taken place when Alcibiades was a very young man at the age of 19. And what I'm going to do is after we look at Plato and the tragedy of Athens, back up, look at the life of Alcibiades overlaid onto the tragedy of Athens. And then Tony and I are going to actually read some excerpts from the Alcibiades dialogue, which are really, in one sense, it's eerie, but it's not, because Plato was very clear what he was doing. Alcibiades was dead at the time that Plato wrote this dialogue. He knows how the story ends. Alcibiades died in 403 or 404. And this is taking place in 432. So Plato is writing a dialogue about a very, very significant figure in Athenian and Greek history, knowing how it ends. And while this is a short dialogue, it's a relatively simple dialogue in the sense that Plato and Socrates, of course, it's a basic exercise in a Socratic dialogue. It nonetheless, I think, is extremely powerful. And by way of preview of coming attractions, next week we're going to look at the dialogue Charmides, which is an even shorter dialogue, but also takes place at the same time in 432, and also includes another tragic figure who I'll introduce a little bit as I get into the discussion. So that's where we're going. So first, I want to take you. I want to look at Athens and what unfolds in Athens in the Peloponnesian War, which started in 432 BC and ended in 404 BC. I want to look at that through Plato's eyes, because his entire lifetime was encompassed, his early lifetime was encompassed by the Peloponnesian War. The war began in 432. Plato himself was born in 428. So the war is already underway. When Plato was 7 years old, in 421, there actually was the possibility of the war ending. There was a peace, it was called the Peace of Nicias, which was negotiated between Athens and Sparta. And these were the two contestants in what is known as the Peloponnesian War, because they are both on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. And a peace had been negotiated. Unfortunately, it didn't last, and the war began again. Now, I want people to stop and think of the generations that have grown up in the United States since the early 1990s. We had the first Iraq War. We had the second Iraq War. We had the Afghanistan War, which went on forever. And I want you to think about a similar situation in Athens, where you have a younger generation which is growing up, in this circumstance of perpetual war. The circumstances for Athens deteriorated very, very significantly in the course of something which was called the Sicilian expedition. Again, through Plato's eyes. This takes place in 415 when Plato is 12 years old. And the key figure that we'll be discussing this evening, Alcibiades, was one of the major figures who actually encouraged the Athenians to embark on this expedition. What was it? It was an invasion of Syracuse on the island of Sicily. So this involved a naval expedition across the Ionian Sea from Greece going westward to Sicily. There were many, many great Greek city-states in Sicily, and it happened to be that Syracuse was the richest. It was not officially allied with the Spartans, but they were also Dorian Greeks, as the Spartans were. So the argument was, Alcibiades' argument in part was, we want the riches, it's going to bolster our position in the war, and so on. And he did convince the Athenians to carry out an expedition to Sicily. It was a disaster, and I will go into more of the background when we talk about Alcibiades himself. But it was a terrible, terrible, terrible defeat for the Athenians. A part of their navy was destroyed. Thousands of Athenians were captured and held in captivity, and I'm sure many of them killed. And it really was the beginning of the end for Athens. And it took another 11 years for the final defeat of Athens in 404. They surrendered to Sparta and its allies, Thebes and Corinth. The Thebans and the Corinthians wanted to do to Athens what Athens had done some years earlier to the Melians. The Athenians had conquered the island of Melos, and what they did is they slaughtered all the men and boys, and they took all the women into captivity. When Athens was defeated in 404, the Thebans and the Corinthians wanted to do that to Athens. Probably for geopolitical reasons, the Spartans stopped them. But if you think about it, if that had been carried out, there would have been no Plato, because he was a 24-year-old in Athens at that time. Instead, what the Spartans did is they imposed what was known as the 30 tyrants. They took Athenians who decided to go along with the Spartans, made them the tyrants of Athens. This included Plato's uncle, Charmides, and his second cousin, Critias. And the 30 tyrants, some of this is going to sound a little bit familiar. It was a complete reign of terror. They carried out executions of their political opponents. They seized their land. They seized their, appropriated all of their holdings. There was suppression. There was censorship. If it sounds a little bit like today, it is a lot like today, carried out by people with the same philosophical mindset. But it didn't last, because these 30 tyrants were overthrown in, I think, a little over a year, around a year. They were overthrown by the radical Democrats, and Plato's uncle and second cousin were executed in 403. He's now 25 years old. Now, I want you to, again, make a comparison to today, because getting rid of the 30 tyrants and replacing them with the Democrats would be kind of like getting rid of Joe Biden and replacing him with Mike Pence or one of these other creatures. Maybe you could compare it to the shift from W. Bush to Obama, but I think we've degenerated incredibly since that period of time. And it's much more of an echo of the insanity which was driving Athens at that point. So these Democrats took over in 403, and in 399, 4 years later, they executed Socrates, who, of course, was Plato's mentor. And Plato at that time was 29 years old. So this is Plato's life up to the age of 29. War, driven by sophistry, political swings of factions back and forth, defeats, and just pure insanity in terms of the way the Athenian society was operating. Now, this didn't happen in a vacuum. In the background, just like today, what you had was an imperial elite. The imperial elite of the time was the Persian Empire. And they really were manipulating both sides. You know, when you talk about the Peloponnesian War, sometimes there's a tendency, Athens good, Sparta bad. It's understandable. Some of you were on, have read Schiller's piece on Sparta versus Athens, in which he goes through the difference between the Spartan constitution and, I will have to say, a more ideal Athenian constitution, and shows that you have two different kinds of societies. You have a society based on slavery and dictatorship, and you have a society, the earlier Athenian society, which was based on the intention to constantly search for the truth. By the time you get into the Peloponnesian War, you cannot recognize that Athens. And again, there really are no good guys and no bad guys. What there is, again, is a Persian imperial elite, which has got its hands all over both sides of this conflict in order to keep Greece essentially destroyed. Now, how did Athens fall prey to this? It started with the elimination of any standard for knowing the truth. Whereas previous Athenian society, and Tony has talked about it, Barbara Boyd talked about it in her class, you know, the Athens of Solon, the Athens of earlier thinkers, was organized around the idea that of a constant search for the truth, that there is truth, there are universal principles, and that our responsibility as members of a political body, whether it's a city-state or today a nation, is to use our God-given creativity, capabilities, to figure out the most truthful things we can so that we can organize our society from that standpoint. That very rapidly went out the window. It first went out the window in terms of the Eleatic philosophy, and I've discussed this in other classes, but the dialogue which Plato sets the earliest, which is in 450 BC, long before this Peloponnesian War, is the Parmenides dialogue. Parmenides was the leading Eleatic, and the Eleatics thought there was a universal, but mere human beings couldn't know that universal. There's more to it than that, but we've discussed that in other locations. That went out the window first, that there's no knowable way of knowing universal principles. But then it degenerated even more. It degenerated to the point of the rejection of the idea of truth itself. And this is where you get full, unbridled sophistry. And Athens was just replete with sophist philosophers, sophists who probably didn't even pretend to be philosophers, but they made a lot of money training the youth of the rich in Athens in how to argue effectively, frankly, any side of the argument, how to get your way. And as I mentioned earlier, if all else fails, then you just use sort of the brutal weapon of censorship, as we're now seeing today in the United States of America. What you ended up with in Athens during this period of degeneration, which leads ultimately to Athens' defeat in 404 and Socrates' execution in 399, you had the rule of opinion. Whoever, and aren't we living through this today? You look at the mainstream media. It is the rule, supposed to be the rule of their opinion. And for a while it worked. Obviously, the spell is broken with Trump, with RFK Jr., with Tucker Carlson. But what we've seen over the course of the last decades is the rule of opinion. While a lot of people have seen through a lot of things, largely because of Donald Trump over the course of the last 6 or 7 years, even people who've seen through a lot of the lies, have seen through a lot of the sophistry, they still have certain knee-jerk reactions to things like big government is bad. We have to get rid of government interference. Well, that's how we got NAFTA and free trade. Or another one where you still get a kind of knee-jerk is Britain is our oldest and dearest ally, which is how we've ended up in the so-called special relationship. Or look at how we've gotten to the point of a potential nuclear conflict with Russia. A lot of Trump supporters and people who listen to RFK and Tucker Carlson, they now see the insanity of war with Russia. But how many of them actually went along with Red Scare kind of ideologies or knee-jerk reactions to the communists in Russia and so on for decades and decades and decades, until somebody with the courage of a Trump to break the bubble finally broke the bubble. So a lot of people now know they're wrong, but do they know why they were wrong? And that is really the purpose of reading Plato and reading Plato's dialogues. Why were they wrong? Or more importantly, how do you actually know what you know? And that is the subject of Plato's dialogues, and it's very much the subject of both Alcibiades and Charmides. So I want to quickly go to the life of Alcibiades and then overlay that onto the tragedy of Athens. Then we will turn to the dialogue itself. As I said, Alcibiades was about a generation older than Plato. He's actually a little bit younger by about 18 years or so than Socrates. So he's sort of in between Socrates and Plato. He was born in 451. He dies in 404, just as Athens is being finally destroyed. And frankly, the time of his birth, 451, 450, is really when the tragedy of Athens begins. The Peloponnesian War started in 432. The tragedy started earlier. Previous to that, Athens had been the most singular force in the Western, what we would today call Western civilization, combating the evil of the Persian Empire. People have heard about the Battle of Marathon, the naval battle of Salamis. These happened in 480, 490, 480 BC. This was the Athenians defeating the Persians, who were the most powerful force in what you would call at the time the civilized world, with far outnumbered. They were far outnumbered by the Persians, and the Athenians defeated them a number of times because they had a superior culture. And because they had a superior culture, they had a superior military capability. The Athenians were also allied with Egypt, which was trying to overthrow Persian rule during this period of time. And in 454, the Athenians had sent a fleet to Egypt to try and help them overthrow Persian rule. They failed, the fleet was destroyed. And I don't know much more of the rest of the history, but by 450, the Athenians had essentially thrown in the towel. They allied with Persia. Well, they didn't ally per se. They signed a peace treaty with Persia that they would stop fighting the Persians. They also betrayed their allies. You had a grouping called the Delian League, which was other city-states in Peloponnnesia who were gathered together in a league, and they all had their treasuries, individual city treasuries, in a place called Delos. When Athens made peace with Persia, they pulled out of the Delian League. They seized all the funds of all the other city-states and took them to Athens. And it was really sort of the first Athens on its way to acting like an empire action. That resulted in a lot of fighting between Athens and the other city-states. In a sense, this was the first Peloponnesian War, and sometimes it's called that. Alcibiades' father was killed in one of those battles. So Alcibiades was born in 451. In 450, the Athenians end the war with Persia and start getting in these spats with their sister city-states. In 446, when Alcibiades is, I guess, 6 years old, his father is killed in one of these battles, and he ends up becoming a ward of Pericles, the leader of Athens. So he's taken to Pericles' court along with his brother, and he's essentially raised by Pericles. There are sophists throughout the house of Pericles. Alcibiades is rubbing shoulders with these figures all the time. And obviously he has aspirations to become a leader in Athens. And it's basically just at the point he's about to leave the house of Pericles and begin serving his military duty, which he does for a couple of years in couple of cases in the company of Socrates himself. That is, they end up in the same place. But it's right before he begins this military duty that the Alcibiades dialogue takes place, where he's 19 years old. By the time he's 30, in 421, he's been given a significant military command, and he's playing a very significant role in Athens, which, as you will see in the dialogue, he aspired to from the very, very beginning. Then things really go downhill. As I mentioned earlier, it is Alcibiades who encourages the Athenians to take on this disastrous Sicilian expedition. He was one of the commanders along with Nicias, but something happened before they could get to Sicily. In fact, before they even embarked from Athens, there was a very strange event which took place in Athens. Now, I have to pause for a second here and just warn people. There are certain things about Athenian society which some of you may consider R-rated or maybe even X-rated, but it is Athenian society, so it is what it is. One of the ways they worshiped the god Hermes in Athens was statues, stone statues throughout Athens, which happened to be in the shape of phallic symbols. And they were called Herms, after Hermes. What happened in 415 is some group of people, somebodies desecrated many of these statues, which was sacrilegious and a very, very serious offense. But at the same time that was happening, Alcibiades and a bunch of other leading people were having a party, and they parodied, they did satires of the Herms, which was just as sacrilegious. And as there was hysteria throughout Athens because of this. And there is quite a counterintelligence story here, which someone might want to dig into at some point, because this reminds me of impeachment trials or Watergate. Very confusing in terms of who's doing what to whom. Well, the impeachment trials weren't all that confusing. Watergate was a little bit more confusing. But obviously there's a larger political agenda behind here. And Alcibiades, because he participated in the sacrilege, not the desecration, but the sacrilege, was one of the people indicted. He demanded an immediate trial. He said, because I'm supposed to be on my way to Sicily to lead this expedition, I want this over with. They wouldn't do it. He embarked with Nicias on the Sicilian expedition. And halfway to Sicily, he was convicted in this trial. His property was seized. He would be arrested and so on. So Alcibiades just decided to get out of Dodge. He left the Athenians and actually went over to the Spartan side. In the meantime, Nicias was left in command of the Athenian expedition to Sicily, which went on for 2 years. And in a final push, they pulled men and material out of Athens. I mean, it kind of reminds you of Ukraine today, and sent them on this final push to seize Syracuse in Sicily. There was an eclipse of the moon. Nicias thought it was a bad sign, so he delayed the assault. The Syracusans found out about it, laid a trap, and that was really the final destruction of the Athenians, because Nicias had been left in charge because Alcibiades got out of Dodge. The rest of Alcibiades' life is really quite incredible. He goes to the Spartans and gives his services to the Spartans for a while in the war. He also gives his services to the Spartan king's wife, and he's found out and has to leave Sparta. Remember that when we get to the dialogue. He goes over to the Persians for a while. Ultimately, he's brought back to Greece in 411. He leads a couple of successful military campaigns, but by this time, the Athenians are crazy. They turn on everybody, and they turned on him once again. So he finally resigned. He retired, but in 404, right before the end of the war, he was assassinated. Some say that the Spartans had made clear they would not make peace with the Athenians, or they wouldn't end the war. I wouldn't call it peace, but they wouldn't end the war with the Athenians as long as Alcibiades was alive, because they were afraid that he might rally them and lead them forward once again. But that is the story of Alcibiades. And that is what Plato knows. He knows the ending. When he writes this dialogue between Socrates and Alcibiades, which is set in 432, again, at the outset of the Peloponnesian War. And again, knowing what is going to happen to Athens and what is going to happen to Alcibiades. So Tony and I are going to read a couple of sections from this. Let me spotlight him too, so that we're both up here. There's some longer sections that we're going to read. I'm going to put up on the screen. Hold on a second. Some maps I didn't use because I know we're running out of a bit of time. I'm going to put on the screen in some of the sections this really delightful painting I found. This is Socrates. This is Alcibiades looking very peacock-like. This figure right here is what Socrates calls his daimon. You know, it looks like the word demon, but it's basically his spiritual advisor, his spiritual guide. Let me say one other thing about Greek society, which some people may find somewhat jarring, but you have to deal with it. Homosexuality was an accepted practice in Athens, and so you will see that in some of the dialogues. I will say, though, that the Athenians probably did not go along with the rest of the LGBTQ alphabet. They probably got as far as the G part. And you don't have the rest of it in Athens. But again, you have to recognize this is 2,500 years ago. So what we're going to be doing is reading several sections to give you a sense of Socrates' efforts with Alcibiades. And then I'm going to fill in some of the things in between, because we're obviously not going to go through the whole dialogue. But Tony, why don't we go ahead and start?
Socrates. I'll be reading Socrates. Now then, you intend, as I say, to come forward as advisor to the Athenians in no great space of time. Well, suppose I were to take hold of you as you were about to ascend the platform and were to ask you, Alcibiades, on what subjects do the Athenians propose to take advice that you should stand up to advise them? Is it something about which you have better knowledge than they? What would be your reply?
I should say, I suppose, it was something about which I knew better than they.
Then you are a good advisor on things about which you actually know.
To be sure.
And you know only the things you have learned from others or discovered yourself.
What could I know besides?
And can it be that you would ever have learned or discovered anything without being willing either to learn it or to inquire into it yourself?
No.
Well, then, would you have been willing to inquire into or learn what you thought you already knew?
No.
So there was a time when you did not think that you knew what you now actually know.
Well, there must have been.
Well, but I know pretty nearly the things that you have learned. Tell me if anything has escaped me. You learned, if I recollect, writing and harping and wrestling. As for fluting, you refused to learn it. These are the things that you know, unless perhaps there's something you have been learning unobserved by me. And this you were not, I believe, if you so much as stepped out of doors either by night or by day. Socrates thinks he's seen Alcibiades studying everything he studied.
No, I've taken no other lessons than those.
Then tell me, will it be when the Athenians are taking advice how they are to do their writing correctly that you are to stand up and advise them?
No, not on that.
Well, what about strokes on the lyre?
No, not that all either.
Nor, in fact, are they accustomed to deliberate on throws and wrestling at the assembly.
No, to be sure.
Then what will be the subject of the advice? For I presume it will not be about building.
No.
For a builder will give better advice than you in that matter.
Yes.
Nor will it be about divination.
No.
For there again, a diviner will better serve than you.
Yes.
Whether he be short or tall, handsome or ugly, noble or ignoble.
Of course.
For on each subject, the advice comes from one who knows, not one who has riches.
Of course.
And whether their mentor be poor or rich will make no difference to the Athenians when they deliberate for the health of the citizens. All that they require of their counselor is that he be a physician.
Naturally.
Then what will they have under consideration if you are right to be standing up when you do so as their advisor?
Their own affairs, Socrates.
Do you mean with regard to shipbuilding and the question as to what sort of ships they ought to get built?
No, I don't, Socrates.
Because I imagine you do not understand shipbuilding. Is that and that alone the reason?
Yeah, that's the reason.
Well, on what sort of affairs of their own do you mean they will be deliberating?
On war, Socrates, or on peace, or on any other of the state's affairs.
Do you mean they will be deliberating with whom they ought to make peace, and on whom they ought to make war, and in what manner?
Yes.
And on whom it is better to do so, ought they not?
Yes.
And at such time as it is better.
Certainly.
And for so long as they had better.
Yes.
Now, if the Athenians should deliberate with whom they should wrestle close, and with whom only at arm's length, and in what manner, would you or the wrestling master be the better advisor?
The wrestling master, I presume.
And can you tell me what the wrestling master would have in view when he advised as to the person with whom they ought not to wrestle close, and when and in what manner? What I mean is something like this. Ought they not to wrestle close with those with whom it is better to do so?
Yes.
And as far as it is better?
Yes.
And at such time as it is better?
Certainly.
But again, when one sings, one has sometimes to accompany the song with harping and stepping.
Yes.
And at such time as is better.
Yes.
And so far as is better.
I agree.
Well, now, since you applied the term better to the two cases of harping for accompaniment of a song and to close wrestling, what do you call better in the case of harping to correspond with what in the case of wrestling I call gymnastic. What do you call the other?
I don't understand.
Try to understand me, for my answer gave you, I think, what is correct in every instance. And that is correct, I assume, which proceeds by the principle of the art, is it not?
Yes,
And was the art not here gymnastic?
to be sure.
And I said that better in the case of wrestling was gymnastic. That
You
is
did.
better, gymnastic governed what's better. And I was quite fair.
I think so.
Come then in your turn, for it would befit you also, I fancy, to argue fairly. Tell me first, what is the art which includes harping and singing and treading the measure correctly? Dancing. What is it called as a whole? You cannot yet tell me?
No.
Well, try another way. Who are the goddesses that foster this art?
The muses, you mean Socrates?
I do. Now just think and say by what name the art is called after them.
Music, I suppose you mean.
Yes, I do. And what is that which proceeds correctly by its principle? As in the other case, I was correct in mentioning to you gymnastic as that which goes by the art. So I ask you accordingly what you say in this case. What manner of proceeding is required?
A musical one.
You're right. Come then, what is it that you term better in respect of what is better in waging war and being at peace? Just as in our other instances, you said that better implied the more musical, and in the parallel case, the more gymnastical. Try now if you can tell me what is the better in this case of war and peace.
But I'm quite unable.
But surely that's disgraceful. For if you should speak to somebody as his advisor on food and say that one sort was better than another at this time and in this quantity, and then he asked you, what do you mean by the better, Alcibiades? In manner like that, you could tell him you meant the more wholesome, although you do not set up to be a physician. Yet in a case where you set up to have knowledge and are ready to stand up and advise as though you knew, are you not ashamed to be unable, as appears, to answer a question upon it? Does it not seem disgraceful?
Very.
Then consider and do your best to tell me the connection of better in being at peace or at war with those to whom we ought to be so disposed.
Well, I'm considering it, but I fail to see it.
But you must know what treatment it is that we allege against each other when we enter upon a war, and what name we give it when we do so.
Oh, okay. We say we are victims of deceit or violence or spoliation.
Enough. How do we suffer each of these things? Try and tell me what difference there is between one way and another.
Do you mean by that, Socrates, whether it is in a just way or an unjust way?
Precisely.
Why, there you have all the difference in the world.
Well, then, on which sort are you going to advise the Athenians to make war? Those who are acting unjustly or those who are doing what is just?
That is a hard question. For even if someone decides that he must go to war with those who are doing what is just, he would not admit that they were doing so.
For that would not be lawful, I suppose.
No, indeed, nor is it considered honorable either.
So you too will appeal to these things in making your speeches.
That's the end of that section, but it's a very, kind of classical case of Socrates showing somebody, in this case, Alcibiades, who wants to become a leader of Athens, that first of all, he doesn't know what he's going to advise them on because he actually has not even thought through certain basic questions. So Alcibiades, now I stopped it at that point with the reference to, you will include this in your speeches in the future, because when you flash forward to 415 with the speech that Alcibiades gives to the Athenians, convincing them to go on the disastrous Sicilian expedition, which I was going to read at the end, but I don't think we're going to have time, or at least an excerpt of it. He clearly is no longer following the promise that he made to Socrates. But what now ensues in the dialogue, again, classic Socratic dialogue, Plato, they start examining the question of what is justice. And they start looking at various things, such as things which are noble and courageous, and good and evil. And again, in kind of classic Socratic fashion, Socrates succeeds in creating various paradoxes. You know, one, for example, is that it's good to save somebody, which they've defined as good, to be courageous. It's good to be courageous. And if you save somebody by being courageous, that's good. But what if you lose your life, which they've defined as evil? So you have something which is both good and evil, and creating these kinds of paradoxes along the way. At which point, Alcibiades admits that he's really quite flummoxed. So, Tony?
Yeah. Socrates has shown him that if he's bewildered about something, it means not only that he doesn't know it, but he thinks that he does know it. So Socrates says here, but if you are bewildered, is it not clear from what has gone before that you're not only ignorant of the greatest things, but while not knowing them, you think that you do?
I'm afraid so.
Alack then, Alcibiades, for the plight you are in. I shrink indeed from giving it a name, but still, as we are alone, let me speak out. You are wedded to stupidity, my fine friend, of the vilest kind. You are impeached of this by your own words and out of your own mouth. And this, it seems, is why you dash into politics before you have been educated. And you're not alone in this plight, but you share it with most of those who manage our city's affairs, except just a few, and perhaps your guardian Pericles.
Yes, you know, Socrates, they say he did not get his wisdom independently, but consorted with many wise men. Actually, it's probably sophists in the translation, such as Pythocles, Anaxagoras, and now old as he is, he still confers with Daimon for that very purpose. But think about what we just saw with Alcibiades. And again, I'll go back to the theme of this class. How many of the people who are running for office, for president, for Congress, for Senate, frankly, don't even rise to the level of Alcibiades at this point. So at this point in the dialogue, they start discussing how rich people pay for knowledge, as he just said with Pericles, and therefore they don't actually know anything. And at that point, Alcibiades really sort of steps into it. So go ahead, Socrates.
Very good. Then what is your intention regarding yourself? Will you remain as you are or take some trouble?
We must put our heads together, Socrates, and indeed, as soon as you speak, I take the point and agree. For the men who manage the city's affairs, apart from a few, do strike me as uneducated.
Then what does that mean?
That if they were educated, I suppose anyone who undertook to contend against them would have to get some knowledge and practice first, as he would for a match with athletes. But now, seeing that these men have gone in for politics as amateurs, what need is there for me to practice and have the trouble of learning? For I am sure that my natural powers alone will give me an easy victory over them.
Ho, ho, my good sir, what a thing to say. How unworthy of your looks and your other advantages.
What do you mean, Socrates? What's the connection?
I am grieved for you and for my love.
Why?
That you should expect your contest to be with the men that we have here.
Now, the dialogue goes on where Socrates makes clear you're not going to be contending against other people in Athens on questions of war and peace. You're going to be contending against the Spartans and the Persians. Now, remember, ultimately, Alcibiades ends up working with the Spartans and with the Persians. What the dialogue does at this point is Socrates goes into a very long discussion of how the Spartans and the Persians are trained, how excellent their education is, making clear to Alcibiades, this is what you would actually be up against. And again, with this kind of preview of coming attraction element in here, there's one point where he's describing the Spartan royal household. And he talks about how closely watched the Spartan wives are, to make sure that they don't end up with a baby that's not actually Spartan. So again, remember that Alcibiades ends up sleeping with the Spartan king's wife and being forced to leave Sparta. And just to sort of dig the knife in, Plato says, or Socrates says, and does it not strike you as disgraceful that our enemies' wives should have a better idea of the qualities that we need for an attempt against them than we have ourselves? So he's really playing with the future of Alcibiades here. So let's go back to Socrates.
Yeah.
It up.
So he says, these people, as she said, the Spartans and the Persians, these people are our competitors, not those whom you think, the Athenians. And there's nothing that will give us ascendancy over them except pain and skill. If you are found wanting in these, you will be found wanting in achievement of renown among Greeks and barbarians both. And of this, I observe you to be more enamored than anyone else ever was of anything that is renown.
Well, then, what are the pains that I must take, Socrates? Can you enlighten me? For I must say, your words are remarkably like the truth.
Yes, I can, but we must put our heads together. We must put our heads together, as to the way in which we can improve ourselves to the utmost. For observe that when I speak of the need of being educated, I am not referring only to you apart from myself, since my case is identical with yours except in one point.
What is that?
My guardian is better and wiser than your one, Pericles.
Who is he, Socrates?
God, Alcibiades, who until this day would not let me converse with you. And trusting in him, I say that though through no other man but me will you attain to eminence. Trusting in him, God, I say that through no other man but me will you attain to eminence.
I mean, this is in a point sort of the one of the singularities in this dialogue, because it's getting to a different level. And again, earlier in the dialogue, Socrates refers to his spiritual advisor as a daimon, which just happens to be the Greek word. It doesn't really mean demon. But here he's talking about God, and I will note it is singular. It's very important throughout Plato's dialogues. Sometimes he talks about the gods, but at critical points, when he's talking about, in a sense, his relationship, he talks about a single God. So the dialogue at that point goes into this question of how do you get real wisdom, essentially. How do you actually know yourself? Man has to know who he really is in order to be able to make these kinds of decisions based on real truth-seeking for justice and other qualities. So they then launch into a discussion where they develop the difference between, I'll use the example he uses, a shoemaker and the things that the shoemaker uses, or a harper and the instrument that the harper uses. And we're getting very close to the end of this discussion, which rises to a very high level. So.
And we admit that the user and what he uses are different things.
Yes.
then the shoemaker and the harper are different from the hands and eyes that they use for their work.
Apparently.
And man uses his whole body too.
To be sure.
And we said that the user and what he uses are different.
Yes.
So man is different from his own body.
It seems so.
Then whatever is man?
I can't say.
Oh, but you can. That he is the user of the body.
Yes.
And the user of it must be the soul.
It must.
And ruler?
Yes.
Now here is a remark from which no one, I think, can dissent.
What?
That man must be one of three things.
What three things?
Soul, body, or both together as one whole.
Yes.
But yet we have admitted that what actually rules the body is man.
We have.
And does the body rule itself?
No.
Because we have said that it is ruled.
Yes.
Then that cannot be what we are seeking.
It seems not.
Why then? Well, then, does the combination of the two rule the body, so that we regard this as man, the combination of body and soul?
Perhaps.
The unlikeliest thing in the world. For if one of the two does not share in the rule, it is quite inconceivable that the combination of two can be ruling.
You're right.
But since neither the body nor the combination of the two is man, we are reduced, I suppose, to this. Either man is nothing at all, or if something, he turns out to be nothing else than the soul.
Precisely.
Well, do you require some yet clearer proof that soul is man?
No, I assure you, I think you have amply proved it.
And if it is tolerably, although not exactly, we are content. Exact knowledge will be ours later, when we have discovered the thing that we passed over just now because it would involve too much consideration.
What is that?
The point suggested in that remark a moment ago that we should first consider the same in itself. But so far, instead of the same, we have been considering what each single thing is in itself. And perhaps we shall be satisfied with that. For surely we cannot say that anything has more absolute possession of ourselves than the soul.
No, indeed.
And it is proper to take the view that you and I are conversing with each other while we make use of words by intercourse of soul with soul.
Quite so. So they've taken this discussion through a number of steps, but where Alcibiades, at least for this moment, does recognize that there's a faculty of soul, which is what has to actually drive mankind and drive his decision making. We reached the point where he can now use what he's learned in this dialogue to hopefully come to a better conclusion than he had at the beginning in terms of if he should be able to govern, how he would govern. So, Socrates.
Hence, it is not license or authority for doing what one pleases that you have to secure to yourself or the state. It is not license or authority for doing what one pleases that you have to secure to yourself or the state, but justice and temperance.
Apparently.
For you and the state, if you act justly and temperately, will act so as to please God.
Naturally.
And as we were saying in just what went before, you will act with your eyes turned on what is divine and bright.
Apparently.
Well, and looking thereon, you will behold and know both yourselves and the good.
Yes.
And so you will act aright and well.
Yes.
Well, now, if you act in this way, I am ready to warrant that you must be happy.
I can rely on your warranty.
But if you act unjustly, with your eyes on the godless and the dark, the probability is that your acts will resemble those through your ignorance of yourselves.
So again, he's he's come to a certain realization of what are the qualities you need to actually be a good leader. But this is very close to the end of the dialogue. The very last exchange between Alcibiades and Socrates, however, very much does foreshadow the future. So Alcibiades says to Socrates, I will begin here and now to take pains over justice.
The
last page.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Fine. Yeah. Good. Why don't you repeat it?
All right. I shall begin here and now to take pains over justice.
I should like to think that you will continue to do so. Yet I am apprehensive, not from any distrust of your nature, but in view of the might of the state, lest it overcome both me and you.
And that is the concluding line of the dialogue, again, which foreshadows the fact that Alcibiades does succumb once again to his baser instincts for renown, as opposed to doing the good. And it leads him on the path which leads to both Athens and his own destruction, essentially. And as Socrates says, he fears the power of the state, what the state will do to him. And of course, we know what it does with his own execution in 399, 5 years after Alcibiades' death. This, again, I think this is a relatively short, but extremely powerful, pregnant dialogue, which is really how all of Plato needs to be read. None of it is academic. It is all very much embedded in the political battles of the day. And as I said at one point earlier, what we're facing with, here you have Alcibiades, who at least went through an exercise of trying to figure out what are the qualities it would take to be a good leader. And he figures a few things out with the help of Socrates, but as you will see in later dialogues where he appears, and you obviously see from the actual history, it doesn't stick. But most of the presidential candidates that we have today don't even rise to the level of an Alcibiades at this point. Fortunately, we do have alternatives, most especially in the form of Donald Trump, who refuses to submit to the brutality of the sophists and the state. And I think that's emboldening others to do the same thing as well. But it would probably do well for people who are running for office, whether they're running for president, Congress, or lower offices, to certainly read this dialogue and put it in its historical context, to become much more conscious of what happens when you try to lead a nation without grappling with the question of universal principles, such that you can actually make the decisions that will ensure that your nation prospers and continues. So I hope people have, in a sense, had a chance to visit Athens from 2,500 years ago and reflect on that process from that day to what is happening in the United States today. I'm going to continue this next week by looking at another tragic figure, Charmides, Plato's uncle, who we referenced a couple of times, and encourage people to read the Charmides dialogue, which is one of his shortest. You can sit down and read it in one sitting before we gather next Saturday. So I'm going to conclude with that and open it up to any discussions or questions.